She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just three bearded mountain men standing beside four horses in 100 miles of wilderness stretching in every direction. The letter had promised one husband and a home. The letter had lied. But what those three men were hiding in that valley, what they had built where no map had ever reached, would change everything she believed about herself, about survival, and about what love looks like when it is earned instead of given. This is her story. The mountain wind carried secrets that Winter and Clara Whitfield was about to become. One of them, she stood at the frost-etched window of a dying cabin, pressing her forehead against glass so cold it burned, watching a man she despised dismount his horse in the yard below. Harlan Crace moved with the casual confidence of someone who had foreclosed on a dozen families that month alone. His leather satchel bulged with papers, deeds, promissory notes, liens, legal words that all meant the same thing in any language. You are finished. Behind her, the cabin breathed its last slow breaths. The roof leaked in 3 places, now dark stains spreading across the ceiling like bruises that would never heal. The iron stove burned through firewood twice as fast as it should because the door no longer sealed properly, and the draft that crept through the gaps carried the smell of a house surrendering to time. Even the land outside seemed exhausted, the soil too tired to produce anything but memories of better harvests and stronger years. Clara counted the fence posts visible through the frosted glass, 14. Her father had driven them into the frozen ground when she was 7 years old, back when his arms were thick as oak limbs and his laugh could fill a valley. Back before the cough started, before the medicine bills began stacking like cordwood in winter. Before everything good in their lives had been slowly and methodically buried under debts they could never repay. Her mother's voice cracked from the doorway behind her. Your father is asking for you. Clara did not turn immediately. She watched Crace tie his horse to the nearest fence post, her father's fence post, with the proprietary ease of a man who already considered it his property. Then she turned and took in her mother's face, and the sight of it hurt worse than any number on a ledger. Maeve Whitfield had been beautiful once. Clara had seen the daguerreotype from her parents' wedding day, her mother's eyes bright and unguarded, her smile wide and careless in the way of someone who still believed the world would be kind. That woman was gone now. In her place stood something brittle and translucent, a creature made entirely of worry and sleepless nights, wearing a gray dress that hung loose where it used to fit snugly, as though even her body was retreating from the life it had been given. How much time did Crace give us? Clara asked, though she already knew. 2 weeks, maybe 3. If we can convince him, we are good for it. We are not good for anything, Mama. We both know it. The words came out harder than she intended, but neither of them flinched. They were past the point of comforting lies. That kindness had been stripped from them the same way the land had been stripped one season at a time until nothing remained but the raw truth underneath. Her father's room smelled of camphor and defeat. Edmund Whitfield lay propped against pillows that had gone gray from use, his breathing wet and labored each inhale, a negotiation with lungs that had long since stopped cooperating. At 43, he looked 70. The consumption had eaten him from the inside out, turning a man who once carried full-grown calves across his shoulders into a wasted collection of bones wrapped in papery skin. His hands, which had built this cabin board by board, which had driven those 14 fence posts into frozen earth, which had held Clara as an infant, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for their size, now lay on the quilt, like fallen leaves curled and dry and trembling. Clara, girl. His voice was barely a whisper, the sound of wind passing through a crack in a wall. Come here, where I can see you proper. She sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to jostle him. Even small movements caused pain now. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes, in the way his jaw clenched against sounds he refused to make. Edmund Whitfield would not groan, would not cry out. He had decided somewhere in the long months of dying that he would do this one last thing with dignity, and Clara loved him for it, even as it broke her heart. I heard Crace's voice, he said. Loud bastard. Never did learn to whisper. Do not talk, Papa. Save your strength. For what? A cough shook him deep and wet, rattling through his chest like stones in a tin pail. When it passed, there were flecks of blood on his lips, bright red against the gray of his skin. I am dying, Clara. We can all stop pretending otherwise, Papa. His hand found hers. The grip was surprisingly strong, as though his body had gathered every remaining ounce of force into this one connection, this one point of contact between father and daughter. "I failed you," he said. "Failed your mother. Built a life on this mountain that turned out to be nothing but a slow way to go broke. You did not fail anyone. You got sick. That is not the same thing, is it not?" His eyes, once the same bright cornflower blue as hers, had gone milky around the edges, clouded by fever, in the particular distance of someone who has already begun the long process of leaving. A man is supposed to provide, protect. I am leaving you with nothing but debts in a cabin that will be Crace's property before the month is out. Something cracked inside Clara's eyes, but she kept her face composed. She had learned early that crying solved nothing. Tears were a luxury like fresh meat or new shoes, something other people could afford. "We will figure something out," she said. "You always were a terrible liar." He squeezed her hand. "But I love you for trying." Outside, she could hear Crace's voice rising in conversation with her mother, every word carrying through walls too thin to hold back anything. Not cold, not sound, not the slow unraveling of a family's last hope. "I am sorry, Mrs. Whitfield, but sympathy does not pay bills. The bank wants their money and they will get it one way or another. If you cannot pay, we will auction everything. The land, the cabin, the livestock, whatever furniture is worth taking. We just need a little more time. Time is exactly what you do not have." Clara stood, her jaw set hard. She had her father's jaw, people said. The same stubborn line, the same way it locked when a decision was being made that could not be unmade. "I will handle this, Papa." "Clara, wait." But she was already gone, boots striking hard against the wooden floor as she marched into the main room, where Crace stood with his ledger open and his eyes already moving over her the way they always did, appraising, calculating, measuring her the way a man might measure livestock at auction. "Miss Whitfield," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "perhaps you can talk sense into your mother. How much? I beg your pardon. How much do we owe total?" Crace smiled, the particular smile of a man who enjoyed the moment of revelation, who savored the look on people's faces when the number landed. $317.42. Plus accruing interest, of course. The number hit like a fist. $317. Her father had never earned more than 60 in a good year, and they had not had a good year in a very long time. The figure might as well have been 3 million. It existed in the same realm of impossibility, a number so far beyond their reach that it was almost abstract, almost meaningless, except that it was not meaningless at all. It was the distance between having a home and having nothing. "And if we cannot pay," Clara said, "then I will be back on the 15th with a sheriff's order. You will have until sundown to remove your personal effects. Everything else becomes property of the bank." "There has to be another way," Maeve whispered from behind Clara, her voice thin as thread. "There is not." Crace closed his ledger with a decisive snap. "I have seen 100 families like yours, Mrs. Whitfield. The ending is always the same. You might as well accept it now and save yourself the false hope." He tipped his hat, a mockery of courtesy, and turned toward the door. He had almost reached it when Clara spoke. "What if I could earn it?" Both Crace and her mother turned to stare. Crace's laugh was sharp and unkind, the sound of a blade being drawn across stone. "Earn it? Doing what exactly? There is not enough sewing work in 3 counties to earn that kind of money. Unless you are suggesting something less respectable." "Watch your mouth," Clara said, and her voice cracked like a whip in the small room. Crace's smile faded. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes, the look of a man not accustomed to being spoken to like that, by a woman, certainly not by one who owed him money. Then he shrugged, settling back into the comfortable armor of his authority. "Reality does not care about your pride, Miss Whitfield. You have 2 weeks. After that, this conversation is over." The door slammed behind him. Maeve sagged into a chair, her hands covering her face. Clara stood frozen in the center of the room, her mind racing through impossible calculations. $317, 2 weeks. There was no combination of work, no miracle, no prayer that could bridge that gap. She had been doing math like this for years now, shuffling numbers like a card sharp, trying to make something out of nothing, and the answer was always the same. Always. But this time there was a letter. It had arrived 2 weeks before, carried by a mail rider who had looked at their crumbling cabin with pity, before handing over the envelope. The letter came through a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis, one of those services that match desperate women in the East with lonely men in the West. Clara had written to them 3 months ago in a moment of desperation so complete it had felt like falling off a cliff. And she had told no one, not her mother, not her father, not even Opal Fenton next door, who knew everything about everyone in El Calo. The response had come from a man named Gideon Hawthorne. The letter was brief, direct, and entirely without sentiment, Miss Whitfield. I am the owner of a ranch in the high mountain country of Montana Territory. I need a wife, not a servant, but a companion and partner. I am prepared to pay off your family's debts in full in exchange for marriage. You will have a home, shelter, food, and your own space and privacy. Whether the marriage works or does not, the debt gets paid regardless. That is my word, and a man keeps his word. G. Hawthorne. Clara had read it 40 times. She had memorized every word, parsed every sentence for hidden meanings, searched for the trap she was certain must be there. A stranger offering to pay $400 more than enough to clear the debt with money to spare, in exchange for marriage to a woman he had never met. It was either salvation or the most elaborate form of destruction she could imagine. She had written back, a cautious letter full of questions he mostly did not answer. His second response was even shorter than the first. I will send payment in advance as a gesture of good faith. If you accept, bring 1 bag of personal belongings and meet my representative at the North Crossroads above El Calo at dawn on March the 14th. If you do not come, I will understand. The money is yours regardless. And now it was March the 12th, and Harlan Craig had just given them 2 weeks, and the bank draft for $400 sat in the bottom of Clara's sewing box like a live coal burning through cloth and wood and every rational thought she had left. That night, the cabin filled with argument the way it filled with cold completely and without mercy. You cannot seriously be considering this, Maeve said for perhaps the 20th time. She paced the small kitchen, her hands twisting a dish towel into knots. Marriage is not something you purchase like flour or nails. You do not even know this man. He could be anyone. He could be violent, unstable, a drunkard, a criminal. People have been arranging marriages for practical reasons since the beginning of time, Mama. This is not an arrangement. This is selling yourself to a stranger. Edmund's voice came from the bedroom, weak but startlingly clear. Let her speak, Maeve. Let the girl speak. Maeve's face crumpled, not at the words but at the strength behind them, the ghost of the man he used to be surfacing for one brief moment before illness pulled him back under. She went to her father's room. Maeve followed. They gathered around his bed, Maeve on one side, Clara on the other, and Edmund looked between them with eyes bright with fever and something else, a terrible clarity. The kind that comes near the end when the body is failing, but the mind burns brighter for knowing it. I am not going to live long enough to see how this turns out, he said. We all know it. So I am going to say my piece while I still can. He took Clara's hand. You are 23 years old and you have already spent 5 years watching this family fall apart. You have put off every chance at a normal life to take care of me. You have never complained, never asked for anything. But I see how you look out that window sometimes, Clara girl, like you are searching for something that is not there. Papa, let me finish. This Hawthorne fellow, I do not know him. Do not know what he is offering beyond what is in that letter. But I know you. You are the smartest person I have ever met and the strongest. If you think this is worth the risk, then I trust your judgment. Maeve made a sound like something tearing. Edmund continued, his hand tightening on Clara's. I also want you to know you have a choice. A real choice. Not a choice between bad and worse, but a choice you make with your eyes open and your spine straight. Whatever you decide, I will be proud of you. Clara looked at her mother. I know this is not what you wanted for me. I know you dreamed I would marry for love, have a proper wedding, build a normal life. But Mama, this is my life, right here, right now. And I would rather face an uncertain future with a stranger than watch us all drown in debt waiting for a miracle that is never coming. Maeve was crying now, silent tears tracking down her worn face. What if he hurts you? Then I will leave. The money is paid either way. He said so himself. I will come home. What if there is no home to come back to? Clara had no answer for that. They sat in silence for a long time, the lamp burning low. the wind picking up outside, pressing against the cabin walls like a living thing trying to get in. Finally, Edmund spoke again, and his voice had changed. It was not the voice of a dying man. It was the voice of a father, and it carried an authority that illness had not managed to take. If you do this, you do it smart. Keep some money hidden where no one can find it. Learn the land around you so you always know the way out. Make yourself valuable enough that he needs you, not just wants you. And remember this, Clara. A contract works both ways. He is buying your presence, not your soul. You hear me? I hear you, Papa. Good. Now here is the other thing. A man who puts his word in writing and backs it with cash before he even meets you, that tells me something. It does not tell me he is good, but it tells me he is serious. And serious men, in my experience, are more dangerous than cruel ones, but also more reliable. You watch him, you learn him, and you make your own judgment. Clara almost smiled. Even dying, her father was teaching her how to survive. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing. Clara sorted through her possessions with ruthless efficiency, choosing what to bring and what to leave behind. One bag, the letter had said, one bag to hold everything she was and everything she hoped to become. She chose carefully. Her mother's sewing kit, its needles worn thin from years of mending clothes that should have been replaced. A few changes of clothing, practical and warm. Her father's pocket watch, heavy brass with a crack across the face that had been there since before she was born. A leather journal her grandmother had given her, its pages still mostly blank, waiting. She packed practical items mixed with sentiment because that was what she was, practical and sentimental in equal measure, and she would not pretend to be otherwise. Word had spread through Elk Hollow with the speed that news always travels in isolated places, which is to say instantaneously and with generous embellishment. By midday, 3 neighbors had stopped by, curiosity barely disguised as concern. Opal Fenton arrived first, eyes bright with the particular excitement of someone in possession of dramatic information. Is it true you are marrying one of those Hawthorne men from up the mountain? That hermit family nobody ever sees except twice a year when they come down for supplies. I am considering it, but Clara, nobody knows anything about them. There are stories. Some people say they are hiding from something. Others say they found gold up in the high country and do not want anyone to know. My husband heard the oldest one used to be a soldier, saw terrible things in the war. Nobody really knows. Then they are just stories, Clara said firmly, not facts. After Opal left, Maeve brought Clara tea. They sat together at the kitchen table in the particular silence of 2 people who have said everything there is to say and are now simply being present with each other the way they had learned during the long vigil of Edmund's illness. I put together a package, Maeve said finally. Some food, a few medical supplies, that blue wool shawl you always liked. Things you might need. Mama, you should keep those. I want you to have them. Maeve's voice was fierce, a sudden flare of the woman she used to be. You are my daughter, Clara. Whether you marry this man or not, whether you stay or go, you are my daughter. That does not change. They held each other. Then 2 women who had survived more than most people ever would, preparing to survive a little more. That evening, Clara walked to her father's room one last time as his daughter alone. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she would belong to someone else, at least on paper, and the girl who had stood at that frost-covered window counting fence posts would begin the slow process of becoming someone new. Tomorrow then, Edmund said. Tomorrow. No regrets. She thought about it honestly, the way he had taught her to think about everything. Not with sentiment or wishful thinking, but with clear eyes and a steady heart. I am terrified, she said. But no regrets. This feels like the right kind of wrong decision, if that makes sense. He laughed, which turned into a cough, which turned into a silence that lasted long enough to frighten her. When he recovered, he said, you are going to be fine, Clara girl. Better than fine. You are going to surprise yourself with how strong you really are. I learned from the best. Your mother and me both. She kissed his forehead, memorizing the feel of his papery skin, the smell of camphor and sickness that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She memorized the shape of his hand in hers, the particular weight of his fingers, because she knew with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone that this was the last time she would stand in this room as the person she currently was, and by the time she came back, if she came back, both of them would be changed beyond recognition. Goodbye, Papa. not goodbye. He squeezed her hand one final time. Just go, and do not look back. Looking back never helped anyone. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky the color of old iron. Clara, dressed in her best dress, dark blue wool, that her mother had sewn 3 years ago, still serviceable if not fashionable. She pinned her dark blonde hair up in a simple style practical for travel and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The face that looked back was familiar, but somehow changed. The same blue eyes, the same straight nose, the same firm mouth. But there was something different in the set of her jaw, in the directness of her gaze. This was a woman who had made a choice. For better or worse, that kind of decision left its mark, and she could see it as clearly as a scar. She picked up her bag, heavier than expected with her mother's additions. Maeve wrapped the blue shawl around her shoulders, hands lingering on Clara's arms. You write to us. Whatever happens, you write, even if it is just a line to let us know you are alive. I will, Mama. I promise, and if things go wrong, if he is not what he seems, you come straight home, I know. They looked at each other, both knowing that home might not exist by the time any letter could arrive. The bank draft had been sent to Harlan Crace yesterday afternoon with instructions to clear the Whitfield debts, but that only bought time, not a future. Eventually, the land would still fail. The cabin would still decay. Clara leaving did not solve everything. It solved only the most immediate crisis. Edmund was too weak to rise, but he called out as she passed his door. Clara, she stopped, did not enter. If she entered, she would never leave. Be brave, but not reckless. Be kind, but not soft. And remember, you always have value no matter what anyone says. A man keeps his word, Clara. If this Hawthorne keeps his, then maybe you have found something real. If he does not, you come home to us. We will figure it out. I hear you, Papa. Good. Now go. She walked out of the cabin without looking back. Her father's words rang in her ears as she crossed the yard past the 14 fence posts and turned north toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the gray sky. The North Crossroads sat exactly 1 mile from the Whitfield property, where the main trail split into 3 paths leading deeper into the mountains. It was a lonely spot marked only by a weathered signpost and a cairn of stones that some long-ago traveler had built for reasons no one remembered. The wind was stronger here, unbroken by trees, cutting through Clara's wool dress like it was made of paper. She expected to see one man. She saw 3. They stood beside 4 horses in the gray pre-dawn light, 3 figures so large they seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. 3 men, broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in worn canvas and rough wool and leather that had seen years of hard use. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she approached, and Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the frozen mud. The one in the center was the tallest, 6.5 feet at least, with chestnut brown hair shot through with lighter streaks from the sun and eyes the color of amber held up to firelight. His face was weathered but not old, perhaps 30 or a little past, with a strong square jaw, shadowed by 2 days of stubble, and a nose that had been broken at least once and set slightly crooked. He stood with his hands at his sides, weight balanced, shoulders back, radiating the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. To his left stood a slightly shorter man, though shorter was relative when everyone involved was over 6 feet. This one had auburn hair that curled at his temples and the same amber eyes as the first, though warmer, softer like honey instead of whiskey. He leaned against his horse with an easy grace, one hand resting on his belt, and when he saw Clara approaching, he was the first to move, stepping forward with a small nod and something that was almost a smile. To the right stood the third. Younger than the others, with dark blonde hair and eyes the color of aged whiskey, and he was the biggest of the 3, 6'7" if he was an inch, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway. His arms were crossed over his chest, his jaw was set hard, and he looked at Clara with an expression that mixed suspicion with something she could not quite identify. Challenge, maybe? Or warning. 4 horses, 3 men, 1 bride who had been promised a single husband. The auburn-haired one reached her first. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that seemed deliberately calibrated to avoid frightening her. "I am Jonah Hawthorne. I apologize for my oldest brother. He is not what you would call gifted at explaining things through letters." Clara stopped walking. Her bag hung heavy from her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain they could hear it. The letter said one husband. The tall one in the center stepped forward at now, removing his hat to reveal more of that sun-streaked chestnut hair. His amber eyes held hers with an intensity that was not aggressive, but was absolute, the gaze of a man accustomed to seeing everything and showing nothing. The letter said one marriage, he said, and his voice was deep, roughened by altitude and wind and years of sparse conversation. That is true. You will marry me on paper legally. My name is Gideon Hawthorne, but you will live with all three of us. We run the ranch together. Share the same roof. I should have explained this from the start. I did not, and for that, I am sorry. The one on the right, the big blonde one with the crossed arm, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a growl. There it is, he said. She is going to bolt. I told you this was a fool's errand, Gideon. I told you from the start. This was Silas. Clara knew it without being told because the hostility coming off him was so specific, so personal, that it could only belong to someone who had argued against this plan and been overruled. He was not looking at her with cruelty. He was looking at her with the absolute certainty that she would disappoint them, and it occurred to Clara that this was a man who had been disappointed so many times he had simply stopped expecting anything else. 3 men, 3 strangers, a marriage she had agreed to under terms that had just fundamentally changed. Clara's mind raced. She thought about turning around, thought about the mile back to the cabin, the frozen mud, her mother's face, her father's cough, thought about the $400 already on its way to Harlan Crace, already erasing the debts that had been killing her family as surely as the consumption was killing her father. That money was spent. That bridge was burned. And she thought about her father's voice, steady even through the pain. A contract works both ways. They are buying your presence, not your soul. I have conditions, Clara said, and she was distantly proud that her voice did not shake. Silas's eyebrows rose. Jonah made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Gideon, for the first time, showed something on that carefully controlled face. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one, the faintest softening around his eyes, that suggested he had just seen something he had not expected. I want everything in writing, Clara continued. Every term of this arrangement documented and signed. I want to understand clearly why 3 men need a mail-order bride when you are obviously capable of providing for yourselves. And I want to see where I will be living before I agree to anything permanent. Gideon studied her for a long moment. The wind blew between them, carrying the scent of pine and snow in distance. Behind him, the mountains rose in layers of gray and white, and the sky was beginning to lighten along the eastern ridge, turning the color of bone. Fair enough, he said. We will marry in town first to make it legal. Then you will see the ranch. If you want to leave after that, the money is still yours. My word does not change. I do not make promises I cannot keep. There it was again. That phrase from the letter. A man keeps his word. He said it like it was carved into his bones, like it was the foundation upon which everything else was built. And Claire realized that whether or not this man was good, he was exactly as her father had predicted, serious. The marriage took place 20 minutes later in the back room of a general store in the nearest settlement, a cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. A circuit preacher with kind eyes and arthritic hands asked the legal questions and received the legal answers. Claire repeated words she barely heard, her mind strangely distant, as though she were watching this happen to someone else from very far away. Did you, Clara Ann Whitfield, take this man? Did she? Did she really? I do. The preacher signed. Gideon signed his handwriting, sharp and precise. Then the pen was in Clara's hand, and her fingers were steady as she wrote her name for the last time. Her old name. When the ink dried, she was Clara Hawthorne. A wife, a stranger to herself. Gideon paid the preacher with coins that caught the weak morning light. Gold coins, Clara noticed, not paper currency. Gold in a territory where most men dealt in scrip and promises. Another detail filed away, another piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Then it was just the 4 of them, married now, standing outside the general store in the cold March morning. Clara and her 3, she did not know what to call them. Her husband and his brothers, her new family, her captors, her saviors. The words all felt wrong. Jonah led a 4th horse forward, a smaller mare with intelligent dark eyes and a calm demeanor. Her name is Flint, he said. She is sure-footed and good-tempered. You will need both where we are going. Clara approached slowly, letting the horse smell her hand before stroking the soft nose. Flint nickered quietly, pressing into Clara's palm, and Clara felt an unexpected rush of warmth. At least she would have one friend in whatever came next. How far, she asked. 2 days if the weather holds, Gideon said. 3 if it does not. And where exactly are we going? North and up, into the high country. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving until we get there. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way of a door being closed. I need you to trust me, Mrs. Hawthorne. Can you do that, Mrs. Hawthorne? The name felt foreign, like words in a language she had never quite learned to speak. I can try, she said. They mounted and turned north toward mountains that rose against the lightning sky like a wall built to keep out everything soft and hopeful and safe. Behind them, the last wisps of smoke from Elk Hollow's morning fires marked the settlement that had been Clara's entire world. She did not look back. Her father had told her not to, and she was still for a little longer her father's daughter. But as the horses climbed and the trail narrowed, and the 3 men arranged themselves around her without discussion, Gideon ahead, Jonah beside Silas, behind him moving in a formation so practiced it looked like instinct, Clara understood one thing with perfect and terrifying clarity. She had come to the crossroads expecting to meet a husband. Instead, she had met 3 strangers who moved like soldiers, who communicated without words, who carried scars they would not explain on bodies built for violence or survival or both. She had married into something she did not understand, and the only map she had was a dead man's advice and her own stubborn refusal to be afraid. The mountains closed around them like a fist, and the trail climbed into cloud, and Clara Hawthorne rode north into whatever waited, because the only direction worse than forward was back. The trail climbed for hours through pine forests so thick that sunlight reached the ground only in thin, broken shafts like light through a cathedral window that had been shattered long ago. The air grew thinner with every mile, colder, sharper, carrying the scent of snow that had not yet fallen, and earth that had frozen solid weeks before. Clara's fingers went numb inside her gloves, and her thighs ached from gripping Flint's sides on switchbacks so steep the horse's hindquarters nearly touched the trail behind them. She watched the 3 men the way her father had taught her to watch everything, with patience, with attention to the details that mattered. Gideon led, moving with the fluid certainty of someone who had traveled this road so many times it was written into his body the way a river carves its path into stone. He never hesitated at a fork, never paused to read the trail. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the ridgelines, the tree line, the sky, cataloging information Clara could not see. He rode like a man who expected trouble and intended to see it coming. Jonah kept pace beside her, close enough to talk, but not so close as to crowd. He pointed things out as they rode, his voice low and unhurried. That ridge there, he said, nodding toward a granite shelf above the tree line. Elk cross there every autumn, heading for the lower valleys. Best hunting in the territory if you know the timing. And that stand of aspen, see how the bark is scarred about 4 feet up. Bear country. They strip the bark for the sap underneath. You can read this forest like a book if you know the language. Clara listened, filing each piece of information away. Jonah spoke about the wilderness the way some men spoke about women, with genuine reverence and the particular attentiveness of someone who found beauty in every detail. His voice was a comfort in the vast silence of the mountains, a human sound against the inhuman scale of everything around them. Silas rode behind. He said nothing. But twice, when the trail narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a single horse, with a drop of several hundred feet falling away to jagged rock below, Clara felt him close the distance, his horse pressing near enough that if Flint stumbled, Silas could grab Clara's reins. Both times, as soon as the trail widened again, he dropped back to his original distance without a word. Protection delivered in silence, and retracted the same way. At midday, they stopped in a small clearing beside a creek that ran fast and clear over smooth stones. Gideon dismounted and began checking the horse's hooves with practiced hands, running his fingers along each leg, lifting each foot, cleaning packed mud and small rocks from the shoes with a hoof pick he produced from his saddlebag. The routine was automatic, thorough, the work of someone who understood that a lame horse in these mountains could mean death. Clara watched his hands. They were large and scarred, the knuckles thick with callus, but they moved over the horses with a gentleness that surprised her. There was a faded mark on his right forearm, that she had not noticed before, a thin white line, too straight and too clean to be a work injury. And on his left shoulder, visible where his shirt had loosened from the ride, the puckered edge of something that looked very much like a healed bullet wound. She said nothing, but she saw, and she remembered her father's words. You watch him. You learn him. Gideon produced dried venison and hard biscuits from his saddlebag and distributed them without ceremony. They ate in the clearing with only the sound of the creek and the wind and the distant scream of a red-tailed hawk circling above the ridge. You are not much for conversation, she said to Gideon, during a silence that had stretched long enough to become its own kind of sound. I am not much for useless talk. If you have questions, ask them. Otherwise, quiet suits me fine. All right. Question. What did you do before you became a rancher in the mountains? Something flickered across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite calculation. Something more private, a door being checked to make sure it was locked before a guest was shown the house. I worked, same as anyone. Doing what? Different things. None particularly interesting. You are being evasive. I am being private. There is a difference. Clara bit back a sharp retort. She was bound to this man now by law and necessity, and starting a fight on the first day seemed unwise. So instead she studied him when she thought he was not looking, and she studied the other two as well, building a picture from small observations the way a hunter builds a picture of an animal from its tracks. The way Gideon sat his horse spoke of years in the saddle. His hands moved with a precision that suggested training beyond what a simple cattleman would need. There was something about his awareness, the constant scanning, the positioning of himself between any potential threat and the people behind him, that spoke of military discipline. And the scars, the bullet wound, the knife mark along his ribs that she had glimpsed when he stretched to adjust his saddle. Jonah was different. His hands were calloused too, but in different places along the fingertips of his left hand and across the base of his right thumb. Musicians' calluses, she realized, guitar or fiddle. His eyes were observant in a different way than Gideon's, not scanning for threats but noticing details, the way light fell through leaves, the shape of a particular stone in the creek bed. He saw beauty where Gideon saw danger. Silas was the hardest to read because he gave the least away. He moved with coiled energy, always tense and always ready, like a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. His eyes were the most unsettling, whiskey-colored and intense, carrying a challenge that seemed directed not at Clara specifically, but at the entire world. They made camp that evening on a flat shelf of rock above the tree line, sheltered from the wind by a natural overhang. Gideon built a lean-to with the speed of someone who could do it in his sleep. Silas disappeared into the trees without explanation. Jonah gathered wood, selecting each piece with care, building the fire in a ring of stones, stacking kindling in a precise lattice that caught flame from a single strike of his fire steel against a strip of birch bark. Clara tended the horses without being asked, brushing them down, checking their hooves the way she had seen Gideon do. You know horses, Gideon observed from beside the growing fire. My father raised them when I was young, before we lost the breeding stock to a fever. Silas returned carrying 2 rabbits already cleaned and gutted. He handed them to Jonah without a word, and Jonah prepared them with startling skill, spitting them on green willow branches, seasoning them with wild thyme gathered during the ride. They ate in a silence that was, to Clara's surprise, not uncomfortable. After the meal, Gideon said, "You should sleep. Hard climb tomorrow." "What about you? I will keep watch for a while." "Old habits." "From what?" He looked at her across the dying fire, his face half in shadow, the amber of his eyes catching the light. "From learning that the mountains do not care if you are tired. They will kill you just as easy sleeping as waking if you are not careful." Clara settled into the lean-to wrapped in blankets that smelled of horse and pine smoke and a faint undercurrent of cedar. She lay listening to the mountain night, wind in the rocks, a distant owl, the pop and settle of the fire. She must have slept because she woke to dawn breaking cold and clear and the smell of coffee. Gideon sat beside the rebuilt fire, and Clara could not tell whether he had slept at all. "Morning," he said, handing her a tin cup. "You did not sleep. I slept enough." They broke camp and rode on. And then in the early afternoon of the second day, after negotiating a final switchback trail, so narrow that Clara closed her eyes and let Flint find the way by instinct, the trail leveled and they emerged onto a high plateau. Clara's breath left her body. Mountains surrounded them on every side, their peaks white with early snow. A valley stretched below, hidden from the lower elevations, accessible only through the narrow pass they had just navigated. It was like stepping through a door into a room that should not exist. The forest here was different, managed. The trees grew in patterns too regular to be natural. Stone markers stood at regular intervals along an actual road were graded and maintained. A water channel had been carved into the hillside with the deliberate precision of engineered infrastructure. This was not the work of a hermit. This was organized, intentional. The buildings appeared gradually, a barn first massive with a stone foundation, then a second barn, a stable, a workshop with a smoking chimney, a storehouse, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a chicken coop, a small dairy with 6 brown cows grazing in a fenced pasture, and finally set back on a gentle rise the house. It was not a cabin, it was a lodge, 2 full stories of solid timber, wide windows, a wraparound porch, stone chimneys at each end, built to last generations, and there were people. A man emerged from the workshop. 2 women crossed between buildings. A boy led draft horses toward the barn. They all stopped when they noticed the riders. Boone Taggart called out first. "Mr. Hawthorne, did not expect you back for another week." Plans changed, Boone. Gideon dismounted and helped Clara down from Flint. "This is my wife, Clara Hawthorne. She will be living here. I expect everyone to make her welcome." The silence that followed had weight. Then a woman emerged from the lodge, descending the porch steps with the measured stride of someone who owned every surface her feet touched. She was perhaps 55, gray-haired and lean with sharp, pale blue eyes that assessed Clara in a single sweeping glance. "Well, now," the woman said, "that is news worth celebrating. Welcome, Mrs. Hawthorne. I am Agatha Pruitt. I keep this house and have done so for 10 years. It has been a bachelor establishment far too long." Agatha led Clara inside and up to the north suite, a room larger than the entire main space of Clara's family cabin. A 4-poster bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window, and a door connecting to the main quarters. "That locks from both sides," Agatha said. "Your privacy is your own, Mrs. Hawthorne. That door opens or stays shut according to your choosing and nobody else's." She paused at the door. Those 3 boys lost their mother to a fever 10 years back, winter of '68. Their father worked in them like mules and loved them not at all, if I am being honest. Gideon raised those 2 younger ones from the time he was 23, fresh back from the war with things in his eyes that did not belong in any young man. Jonah was 18, Silas was 16, Gideon became father and mother and foreman and all at once, and he has been carrying that weight ever since. She looked at Clara. He needs someone who will carry some of it with him. Not for him, with him. You can be that ally, Mrs. Hawthorne, if you choose, or you can just be a contractual obligation. The choice is yours. After Agatha left, Clara opened her grandmother's journal and wrote, "I married a stranger to save my family. The stranger turned out to be 3 strangers. One will not look at me, one will not stop being kind, and the one I swore myself to before a preacher will not tell me who he really is. I do not know if I am lucky or foolish, but I will stay long enough to find out." The days found their rhythm the way water finds its course through stone, not quickly, not smoothly, but with a persistence that eventually carves something permanent. Clara rose each morning before full light and descended to find Agatha commanding the kitchen. Cornbread in the oven, bacon in the cast iron, coffee boiling black on the stove. She learned names. Boone Taggart, the foreman, a quiet man called Eames, who handled the horses, 2 brothers named Prescott, who managed the sawmill, a boy called Dodd, who worked with twice his years of competence. She learned the buildings, the barns, the workshop, the smokehouse where venison and elk hung in fragrant rows over smoldering hickory, the root cellar, the dairy, the kitchen garden Agatha maintained with ferocious pride, and she learned the 3 brothers, though learning them was slower work. Learning them was like learning weather. You could study it all you wanted, but it would still surprise you. Gideon was often absent, riding out to check logging operations or locked in his office with ledgers. When they interacted, he was courteous and careful the way a man is courteous with a new horse he does not want to spook. Jonah was the easiest. He appeared without pressure, showing her the valley in pieces. One afternoon, she found a small object on her writing desk, A horse carved from cedar small enough to fit in her palm worked with such precision that she could see individual strands of the mane. It was flint, unmistakably flint. She asked Agatha who made it. Agatha only smiled. Jonah has the hands of an artist. Sees more than he says, that one. Silas was the hardest. He maintained his wall of silence with the dedication of a mason maintaining a fortress. But there were fractures. One morning she slipped on icy porch steps and a hand caught her elbow. A grip strong enough to crush bone applied so gently it barely creased her sleeve. Silas. He steadied her for 2 heartbeats, then released her arm and walked away without a word. The next morning leather work gloves appeared outside her door, soft lined with rabbit fur. No note, no one claimed them. But the leather smelled of the workshop where Silas spent his evenings. Clara wore them every day. The storm came on a Tuesday 3 weeks after her arrival. Wind not snow, a gale that tore roofing from the horse barn. Gideon shouted orders. Silas was already on the roof with no rope and no apparent concern for the 30-foot drop. Jonah worked below, passing lumber upward. Clara watched from the porch for 30 seconds. Then she fired the second stove, boiled water, made coffee in army quantities, carried it to workers on a tray, threw the wind-checked hands for frostbite, wrapped a cut on a young worker's palm, organized the women to prepare hot food. Nobody asked her. Nobody had to. Silas lost his footing on the wet roof. For one terrible second, he swung from a rafter by one hand, boots kicking at nothing. Then he hauled himself back up. Jonah called from below, "Take your time up there. You look real pretty hanging like that." And Clara, standing in the yard with coffee cups, laughed, the first real laugh since arriving. Several workers turned to stare. Jonah grinned. Even Silas, clinging to the roof, paused long enough to look down at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger, not suspicion, something closer to bewilderment. That evening, for the first time, all 4 sat together after dinner. Gideon by the fire, Jonah with his guitar, Silas sharpening a knife, Clara knitting. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled. 4 people each doing their own work, needing nothing from the others except presence. It felt in its quiet way like a room where a family might sit. Clara dropped her ball of yarn. It rolled toward Gideon. He bent to pick it up at the same moment she reached for it, and their hands met, her small fingers against his scarred knuckles. They both went still. 2 heartbeats, 3, his hand warm and rough and steady. Then he withdrew and held the yarn out. "Here," he said, his voice normal, his eyes not. Across the room, Jonah's guitar paused 1 beat. Silas's whetstone went silent 1 stroke. Then both resumed. 3 days later, Clara found the discrepancy in the ledgers. Seasonal worker deductions, room and board fees hidden in the accounting. She carried the ledger to Gideon's office. "These deductions, you pay above standard wages. That is admirable. But you take it back through charges the workers probably do not realize. That is not admirable. That is how my father ran the operation. Your father is gone. You are not required to run it his way. You have been here 3 weeks. Do not presume to understand a system that took 20 years to build. I do not understand the system. I understand fairness. They are different things." Then from the hallway, a voice she did not expect. "She is right." Silas, arms crossed, having heard every word, he said nothing else, turned and walked away. 2 days later, the deductions disappeared from the books. Gideon never mentioned it, neither did Clara. But the numbers told the truth. On the morning of her 4th week, Clara stood at her window watching Gideon saddle his horse below. He was leaving for the northern timber stands, a 2-day ride. As she watched, he paused and looked up at her window. She did not step back. They simply looked at each other through the cold glass and the cold air, and in that look something passed between them that was not yet trust and not yet affection, but was the raw material from which both could eventually be made. But what she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet days were already ending. The letter that arrived the following morning would see to that. A rider appeared from the direction of the pass in the early afternoon, young and hard-ridden, carrying a sealed envelope from Denver. Gideon was still in the northern stands, so it was Jonah who received it, and Jonah who sent Dodd galloping north to bring his brother back. The boy returned the next morning with Gideon riding behind him, and Clara watched from the porch as Gideon dismounted, took the envelope from Jonah, broke the seal, and read. She could see his jaw tighten from 50 feet away. She could see his shoulders square the way they did when he was preparing for something that would require every ounce of the control he maintained. When he looked up, his eyes found hers immediately, as if he had known exactly where she would be standing. "Come to my office," he said. "This concerns you too." The office was smaller than she expected, lined with maps and ledgers, dominated by a heavy desk covered in correspondence. But it was the map on the wall that stopped Clara. It was massive, hand-drawn, showing not just the hidden valley, but dozens of other locations throughout the territory. Red marks indicated active logging sites. Blue marks showed processing facilities. Green marks represented property holdings. The scale of it was staggering. "My father spent 30 years building this," Gideon said, watching her take it in. "Started with one logging contract and a borrowed wagon. Ended with the largest independent timber operation between Denver and San Francisco. 200 workers directly. Another 300 depending on our contracts for their livelihood." Clara stared at the map. She had known the valley was more than it appeared, but this was something else entirely. This was an empire. Gideon tossed the letter onto his desk. "My Uncle Virgil wants a meeting. He has been persistent about certain business matters. He wants control, or at least a share of it. My father excluded him from the will for good reasons, primarily a gambling habit that required 2 separate bailouts. Virgil has never accepted all that. What does he want now? A formal meeting with all stakeholders in Denver. He is claiming I have been mismanaging the operation. Wants to put me on trial in front of investors whose opinions matter to our survival. Have you been mismanaging? No, we are solvent, profitable, and growing. But Virgil has always been good at making accusations that require extensive effort to disprove. He will question my age, my experience, my judgment. He will imply I am alienating partners, making reckless decisions, running the operation into the ground. And what does this have to do with me?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. Appearances matter in business. A married man looks more stable. And Virgil has been spreading rumors that the Hawthorne brothers are hermits, unfit for civilized society, incapable of building anything beyond a lonely outpost in the mountains. Bringing a wife proves him wrong. So I am a weapon. You are an ally. There is a difference. Clara studied the map, her mind already working through the dynamics of what he was describing. 3 investors, he told her. Thaddeus Cowell, a railroad man who valued stability above all else and represented 40% of their revenue. Eleanor Braddock, a woman who ran mining operations with the shrewdness of a general and the independence of a cat. And Mercer Ainsley, representing Eastern money that was ambitious but skittish. Clara spent 6 days learning everything. Gideon taught her the finances. Silas, to everyone's surprise, including his own, taught her the technical side, the types of timber, the grading systems, the cutting techniques that made Hawthorne lumber superior to their competitors. When Silas spoke about wood and forests, Clara discovered he became a different person entirely. Passionate, detailed. His whiskey-colored eyes lit with a knowledge that was not just expertise, but love. And Clara understood for the first time that this angry, guarded man had a language after all. It was not made of words. It was made of the forest itself. Jonah stayed behind to manage the valley. He was not happy about it, but he understood. The night before they left, Clara found him on the porch playing guitar, a melody so quiet it was almost a conversation with the wind. "I wish you were coming," she said. He did not look up from the strings. "Someone has to keep this place running. That is fighting too, just a different kind." She touched his arm briefly. "When I get back, I want to hear that song properly." He looked at her then, and something passed across his face that Clara could not quite name, something deeper than warmth and more careful than affection. "When you get back," he said. The journey to Denver took 4 days. On the stagecoach, Clara sat between Gideon and Silas, the space crowded and close. At a way station where they stopped to change horses, a drunk man approached Clara while she was fetching water from the pump. He stood too close, smelling of whiskey and unwashed wool, his hand reaching toward her arm. Before Clara could react, Silas was there. He did not touch the man, did not speak, simply placed himself between them like a wall made of muscle and silence. The drunk looked up, took in the full measure of what was standing in front of him, and retreated without a word. "You all right?" Silas asked. It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 6 weeks. "I am fine, thank you." A beat of silence. Then he nodded and walked back toward the coach. But from that point forward on the rest of the journey, he sat closer. His shoulder touched hers when the coach rocked on rough road. He did not pull away. And Clara understood that something in the wall had cracked. Not broken, but cracked. Denver was larger than Clara had imagined. 30,000 people with paved streets in the center, gas lamps being installed, buildings rising 3 and 4 stories. The contrast to the hidden valley was jarring. Gideon had reserved rooms at the Windsor Hotel, and the clerk's demeanor shifted visibly when Gideon signed the register. The meeting took place in the territorial business office, an imposing building of stone and glass. The conference room was already partially filled when they arrived. Men in expensive suits, papers spread across a massive oak table, the air thick with cigar smoke and tension. Virgil Hawthorne was obvious even before Gideon identified him. He stood near the head of the table holding court with several other men, his gestures expansive, his confidence the particular kind that comes from believing the world owes you something. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the soft build of someone who had lived well but not carefully. When his eyes landed on Gideon, they held contempt. When they moved to Clara, they held calculation. Nephew Virgil said loudly, "So good of you to join us. And who is this charming creature?" "My wife, Clara Hawthorne." "Wife? Well, rather sudden, was it not?" "We prefer to keep our personal affairs private," Gideon said. Virgil made his case with practiced theatricality. Changes to logging practices that reduced efficiency. Alienated partners, no expansion. And the personal attacks, just as Gideon had predicted. The sudden marriage to a woman of unknown background. The implication that the Hawthorne brothers were unsuitable for the responsibilities they carried. Then Virgil said the words that brought Clara to her feet. "And this marriage," he said, gesturing toward her. "A nobody from nowhere brought into the family to lend credibility to a failing operation. Surely the investors see through this transparent ploy." Clara stood. The room went silent. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, and her voice carried the way her father's voice had carried, clear and level, and utterly without apology. "You are absolutely right that no one here knows my background. Allow me to address that." She spoke without notes, without preparation, beyond the 6 days of study that had given her a command of the timber operation most foremen would envy. She explained her background honestly. A struggling settlement, medical debts, a practical marriage. Then she turned the blade. "You question my background, Mr. Hawthorne. I question your motives. This meeting is not about concern for the business. It is about resentment that your nephew succeeded where you never did." Eleanor Braddock, the mining investor, spoke from the end of the table. "Mrs. Hawthorne raises an interesting point, Mr. Virgil Hawthorne. What exactly is your business experience beyond being related to the founder?" Virgil sputtered. Gideon produced documentation of both bailouts. Thaddeus Cowell expressed satisfaction with 3 years of stable operations. Mercer Ainsley abandoned his skepticism in favor of enthusiasm for the sustainable approach. Eleanor Braddock smiled at Clara with the particular smile of one woman recognizing capability in another. When the room cleared and it was just the 3 of them, Silas turned to Clara. "You did not have to do that. Stand up. Defend us." "Yes, I did. We are family. Family fights together." He said nothing more. But when they left the building, he walked beside her. Not behind. Beside. That evening, a cream-colored envelope arrived at the hotel. An invitation from Lenora Hawthorne, Virgil's wife. A dinner party to properly welcome the new Mrs. Hawthorne to the family. Gideon's expression darkened. "This is a trap." "Obviously," Clara said. "But if we do not go, Lenora will say the poor mountain bride cannot handle civilized company." The dinner was everything Clara expected and worse. 40 guests in a 3-story mansion. Lenora in diamonds and strategic malice, asking questions designed to expose every gap in Clara's education, breeding, and social standing. Clara answered each one directly, without apology, without pretense. "Our marriage was pragmatic," she told a circle of fascinated women. "Honesty strikes me as far more romantic than pretty lies." Eleanor Braddock appeared at her elbow near the end of the evening. "That was well handled," she said quietly. "I have a proposition for you and your husband. Not tonight, but soon." On the carriage ride back to the hotel, Gideon took Clara's hand. The first time he had initiated contact beyond necessity, his grip was warm and certain. "Thank you for standing with me," he said. "Standing with us," Clara corrected. "We are stronger together than apart." Neither of them let go for the rest of the ride. The following morning, Eleanor Braddock's office was everything Lenora's mansion was not. Functional, efficient, a desk covered in papers and maps of mining operations. "I want to hire you," Eleanor said, looking at Clara, "not as Gideon's wife, as an independent consultant. Your own contract, your own income, your own professional identity. You have intelligence, courage, and the ability to stand up to powerful people without backing down. Those qualities are rare and valuable." Clara looked at Gideon. He nodded. "Your choice," he said. Then yes. They returned to the valley 3 days later. Jonah met them with coffee and a warm meal, and Clara realized with surprise that it felt like coming home. That evening, Gideon found her on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you before Denver." They went to his office. He sat behind his desk and was quiet for a long time. "I served in the war," he said finally. "The last year, 64 to 65. I was 19. I came home with this." He touched his shoulder, where the bullet scar was hidden beneath his shirt, "and things in my head that have never fully left. Our mother was already sick when I got back. She died in 68. Fever. Jonah was 18. Silas was 16. Our father pointed at a map and said, 'Now we work.' He never asked us how we were, never asked what I had seen. Just work." His voice was steady, but his hands on the desk were not. Clara saw the tremor in his fingers, the particular shake of a man holding something together by will alone. "I have tried to carry all of it," he said. "The business, Silas, Jonah, this valley, everyone who depends on us. And I am running out of the thing that keeps it held together. I did not bring you here just for Virgil or for appearances. I brought you here because, I needed someone strong enough to stand beside me without breaking. Someone to share the weight, not carry it for me. Share it." Clara crossed the room and took his hands. The trembling slowed under her touch but did not stop. "You have not broken," she said. "You have endured, but you do not have to endure alone anymore. Winter always ends, Gideon, even this one." He looked at her with eyes that held 10 years of exhaustion and something else, something that had been growing in the silences between them, in the shared glances and accidental touches and the slow accumulation of trust that neither of them had planned. But what came next was not the confession she expected. The telegram arrived 4 days later, carried by a courier who had braved the early season snow. Clara read it standing in the main room while Agatha watched from the doorway. Father passed peacefully. "Stop. Debts cleared. Stop. Thank you. Stop, Mother." She read it twice. Then she sat down on the nearest chair and cried. She cried for the first time since arriving in the valley, deep and silent and thorough, the kind of crying that empties a person of everything they have been carrying so they can begin carrying something new. Gideon appeared. He said nothing, simply stood near, not touching, not speaking, offering his presence the way he offered everything without conditions or expectations. Silas appeared later that evening. He placed a cup of hot tea outside her door, and beside it a small piece of wood carved into the shape of a snowflake delicate as lace. He knocked once softly and was gone before she opened the door. Jonah came that night with his guitar. He sat in the chair beside the fireplace where she had curled herself into a knot of grief and played something low and aching and beautiful, a melody that did not try to fix her sadness, but simply sat beside it, keeping it company, the way only music can. 3 men, 3 different kinds of comfort, and Clara for the first time felt the full weight of what it meant to have a family again. Winter sealed the valley completely in November, the passes buried under snow that would not melt until April. 23 people, 1 compound, 5 months of cold. Clara discovered she had a gift for managing the social dynamics of close quarters. She organized communal dinners, established a lending library from the lodge's books, created work rotations that kept people busy without exhausting them, settled disputes between workers, and slowly, carefully, she became the person everyone looked to when decisions needed to be made about daily life in the compound. The relationship with Gideon deepened through 1,000 small moments. Evening conversations by the fireplace that started as business discussions and ended as something else. Shared silences that were no longer uncomfortable. The brush of hands when passing papers. The way he began leaving books on her desk that he thought she would enjoy with passages marked in pencil. The way she began making his coffee before he came downstairs learning exactly how he liked it without ever asking. One evening, weeks into winter, they sat in the chairs by his office fire. The conversation had faded into comfortable quiet. Outside, wind pressed against the walls with the patient force of something that had all the time in the world. "This marriage," Clara said softly, "it is not what either of us expected." "No, it is better." He stood and crossed the small space between their chairs, and he took her hand and drew her to her feet, and he kissed her. Not a kiss of obligation or performance, but something real and unhurried, tasting of coffee and wood smoke, his beard rough against her skin, his hands gentle on her arms. And it was everything a first kiss should be when it comes after months of earning and waiting and choosing. When they parted, Clara's breath was unsteady. "That was overdue," Gideon said. "Why did you wait so long?" "Because I wanted you to choose this. Choose me. Not because of a contract. I choose you," she said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." But the letter she found 3 days later nearly destroyed everything. She was tidying Gideon's desk while he was at the sawmill organizing papers that had accumulated during the winter. In the back of a drawer beneath a stack of old correspondence, she found a letter written in Gideon's hand addressed to Virgil's, dated 2 weeks before he had contacted the mail-order bride agency. "If you want war, I will give you war, and I will have a weapon you do not expect." Clara read it twice. The blood drained from her face. A weapon you do not expect. She was the weapon. Not a partner, not a companion, not a wife. A weapon in a war with his uncle planned and procured, like ammunition selected and deployed, with the same cold calculation that Gideon applied to everything. She was waiting in his office when he returned the letter on the desk between them. "Explain this," she said. Gideon looked at the letter. The color left his face. "Clara, a weapon you do not expect. That is what I am, what I have always been. You did not look for a wife, Gideon. You looked for a chess piece, and I was desperate enough to serve the purpose." He did not deny it. That more than anything confirmed what she already knew. "In the beginning," he said, "yes, the plan was for Virgil. I needed a wife to counter his narrative, and I was willing to buy one. But that was before I met you, before I knew you. Everything after that, everything real between us, that was not strategy. That was me falling in love with someone I never expected." "How am I supposed to believe that? You have been calculating every move since the day you wrote that first letter. How do I know this is not another calculation? The right words at the right time for the right effect." Gideon had no answer. His silence filled the room like smoke. Clara locked the connecting door that night, for the first time since the early weeks. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the loudest thing in the lodge. She went to the porch despite the cold, wrapping her mother's blue shawl around her shoulders. The night was clear and brutal, stars like broken glass across a black sky, the temperature falling towards something that could kill. She did not care. Footsteps on the porch, not Gideon's, heavier, slower, deliberate. Silas sat down beside her without invitation. He did not remove his coat, but he took off the heavy sheepskin jacket he wore over it and draped it across her shoulders on top of the shawl. The weight of it settled over her like armor. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. 20. The cold bit into every exposed surface, but neither of them moved. Finally, Clara spoke. "Did you know about the letter?" "No, but I know my brother. He calculates everything, always has. It is how he survived the war, how he survived our father, how he survived everything that should have broken him. That does not excuse it, no. But here is what I do know. From the day you arrived, he changed. Not because of a plan, because of you. I watched it happen. I have known Gideon my whole life, and I have never seen him be the man he is with you. That is not strategy. That is something he does not know how to fake because he has never felt it before." Clara said nothing. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing that weighed more than anything Gideon could have offered. "I know because I changed too." The words hung in the freezing air between them, visible, almost like breath made solid. Silas, who had spent months building walls against her, who had fought against her presence from the first moment at the crossroads, who showed affection only through anonymous gifts and wordless protection, had just admitted what months of silence had been trying to say. Clara felt tears freeze on her cheeks. She did not wipe them. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, and Silas went to the barn or the workshop or wherever he went to be alone with the things he could not say, and Clara went to her room and lay in the dark behind her locked door and tried to decide whether love built on a lie could still be real or whether the lie poisoned everything it touched. She was still deciding when she smelled smoke. It came through the window she had cracked for air, faint at first, then thickening rapidly. Clara was at the glass in seconds. The workshop was on fire, flames already licking at the roof, the wind carrying sparks toward the main timber storage shed where thousands of board feet of lumber sat waiting for spring delivery. If that shed caught half the year's revenue, would burn. And with it, every contract, every investor relationship, every piece of credibility they had built. Clara ran. She hit the compound yard, still pulling on boots, screaming for water, screaming for buckets. The bell in the yard tower was already ringing. Gideon emerged from the lodge moments later, barefoot, pulling on a shirt, and his voice cut through the chaos with the same authority she had heard in the Denver conference room. Except now it was the voice of a man commanding in a battle, and Clara understood finally what he had been before the mountains. Silas was already at the fire. He had been closest sleeping in the workshop annex, as he sometimes did when he worked late on equipment repairs. He had the hose from the water system turned on the base of the blaze, his face lit orange by the flames, and he was directing two workers to form a bucket brigade from the creek. He moved with terrifying efficiency, no wasted motion, every decision made in the same heartbeat it was needed. The war had trained Gideon for command, and Gideon had trained Silas for everything else. Clara did not run toward the fire. She ran toward the people. She found the women and the boy Dodd and organized them with an authority she did not know she possessed. Get the children to the lodge. Fill every vessel we own with water. Set up a medical station in the kitchen. Tear sheets for bandages. Boil water. Nobody questioned her. Nobody hesitated. They moved because she told them to move in, and they moved correctly. And later Boone Taggart would say it was the difference between losing a building and losing everything. The fire reached for the timber shed. Gideon wanted to go in. Clara stepped in front of him. If you go in there and get hurt, who runs this operation? Trust Silas. He knows what he's doing. Gideon looked at her, his face agonized, his body straining toward his brother and the flames, but he stayed. Because she asked him to. Because even now, even with a locked door between their rooms and a letter that had broken something between them, her words still mattered to him more than his own impulse. Silas made the call that saved them. He ordered 3 men to chop down the trees between the workshop and the timber shed, creating a firebreak, sacrificing the smaller structure to save the larger one. It was a military decision. Cold, precise, brutal. And it worked. The fire stopped 30 feet from the main shed. The workshop was destroyed. Some lumber was lost. But the bulk of the operation survived. Silas came out of the smoke, coughing, his face black with soot. His hands burned, his shirt singed through in 3 places. Clara ran to him without thinking, grabbing his hands, turning them over to examine the burns. You could have been killed, so she said, and her voice broke on the last word. So could you. You should have stayed in the lodge. I was where my family needed me. His hands burned and calloused and shaking with adrenaline closed around hers. 2 heartbeats. 3. Then he let go, but the look in his whiskey-colored eyes before he turned away was something Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life. They found the arsonist before dawn, a seasonal worker named Ned Greer, hired 3 weeks earlier with forged references, caught trying to escape through the pass on foot. He confessed within the hour. Virgil Hawthorne had paid him to set the fire, hoping the destruction would prove the brothers incapable and force a reorganization of the company. Gideon sent the evidence to the territorial authorities. Another charge added to the growing case against Virgil. But the fire had done something Virgil never intended. It had answered Clara's question. She stood on the porch the morning after watching the compound begin the slow work of rebuilding. Her pack bag sat at her feet. She had brought it downstairs in the darkest hour of the night, not sure whether she was leaving or staying, knowing only that the decision could not be deferred any longer. Gideon found her there. His eyes went to the bag, and something in his face collapsed. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a foundation settles when the ground beneath it shifts. You are leaving, he said. Not a question. I am not leaving because I have nowhere else to go, Clara said. I am staying because everywhere else is nowhere without this place. He stared at her. The letter to Virgil, she said. The word weapon. That was wrong. I need you to hear me say that, and I need you to agree. I am not a weapon. I am not a chess piece. I am not a tool for winning a war with your uncle. I am your partner, your wife, your home. And if you ever treat me as less than that again, I will walk out that door and not come back. Are we clear? We are clear. Then do not ever make me doubt you again. She looked at him, this complicated, damaged, calculating, honorable man who had offered her salvation and deception in the same hand. I choose this. I choose you. Not because of a contract. Because I watched you let Silas run into a fire because I told you to trust him. Because I watched you stand in that yard and put your brother's life above your own instinct. Because you are a good man, Gideon Hawthorne, even when you do not know how to be one without a plan. He took the bag from her hand, set it inside the door, and closed it against the morning cold. We build this together, he said. From here, everything honest, everything real. Winter always ends, Clara said. Even this one. Spring came to Shadow Creek Valley in fits and starts, the snow retreating up the mountainsides like a tide going out, revealing ground that was hungry for sun and seed. With it came a different kind of renewal. They married again. Not the hurried legal transaction in the back of a general store, but a real ceremony. Clara chose the place, the bank of the wide creek where the water ran clear and fast over smooth stones, and the first wildflowers were beginning to push through the melting snow. The entire compound attended. Agatha cooked for 2 days. Boone Taggart stood as witness. Jonah played guitar, a song he had written in the winter months. Something tender and strong and entirely without words, a melody that said everything language could not. And Silas, to the astonishment of everyone present, stood before the gathered community and read a poem in a voice rough with disuse and thick with emotion. It was the poem their mother had loved best, the one she had read to Gideon before she died, and Silas recited it from memory without missing a single word. Agatha wept. Several of the workers looked away to compose themselves. Clara could not look away at all. Gideon's vows were simple. I do not promise easy. I promise honest. I promise I will never treat you as less than what you are. You are where I belong. Clara's were simpler still. I did not come here for love. I am staying for it. That is the difference. And I will keep choosing this, choosing you every single day. That night, the connecting door between their rooms opened for the last time because after that, there was no need for 2 rooms, and the door stayed open, and outside the last snowflakes of winter dissolved into the spring creek and were carried away. The months that followed brought the hard good work of building. Clara threw herself into the consulting work for Eleanor Braddock, traveling to mining operations when the passes were open, writing reports that changed how the industry thought about resource extraction. She discovered is she could explain complex ideas in clear terms, could connect theory to practice, could inspire hardened foremen to reconsider methods they had used for decades. You have a gift, Eleanor told her. Do not underestimate it. Virgil Hawthorne was convicted on charges of fraud and arson, sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. Lenora left Denver for San Francisco, her social standing destroyed. The last letter from Lenora was brief and bitter. Your poor mountain wife proved more formidable than any of us expected. Clara read it and felt nothing but mild pity for a woman who had never understood that strength was not the same as status. Summer brought Maeve Whitfield to the valley. She arrived on a bright July afternoon, traveling with a neighbor, and stood in the compound yard with her mouth open and her eyes wide. Clara, she breathed. You did not tell me. I wanted you to see it yourself. Maeve spent 2 weeks absorbing everything. The scale of the operation, the quality of the lodge, the respect the workers showed Clara, the way 3 men orbited her daughter like planets around a sun, each in his own way, each at his own distance, all of them drawn by the same gravity. Your father would be proud, Maeve said one evening, not because of the wealth. He would have seen through that in a moment, because you took an impossible situation and made it into something extraordinary. Clara invited her mother to stay. A small house at the edge of the compound, close enough for community, far enough for independence. Maeve accepted. The Hawthorne Institute for Sustainable Resource Management launched that autumn with a name more ambitious than its size. Clara wrote the curriculum. Gideon managed the partnerships. Silas taught the practical sessions, standing in front of experienced foremen and speaking with an authority and passion that astonished everyone who had known him only as the silent, angry youngest brother. Jonah handled the logistics, and in the evenings provided the music that became as much a part of the Institute's identity as its teachings. The first class graduated 6 foremen from operations across the territory. The second class was larger. By the third year, they had trained 43 managers and published a textbook with Clara's name alongside Gideon's on the cover. Clara established a fund for families facing medical debt, the kind that had nearly destroyed her own. She hired workers from struggling settlements, offering training and opportunity. She wrote articles about the hidden costs of poverty and the barriers facing women in business. On a spring morning in their second year, Clara told Gideon she was pregnant. His hands, which could split firewood all day without trembling, shook when she placed them against her belly. Silas built a cradle from cedar carved with wildflowers on the headboard, sanded smooth as silk. Jonah wrote a lullaby. The girl came in autumn, small and fierce, with her mother's blue eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. They named her Maeve Edmund Hawthorne for both grandparents, one living and one gone. Clara held her daughter for the first time and said, "Winter always ends, and spring always comes." A second child followed 2 years later, a boy with Gideon's height and Clara's quick mind. The lodge expanded. The compound grew. A school opened with Clara teaching reading and writing to the workers' children. Years passed the way they do, when life is full quickly and slowly at the same time, each day unremarkable in itself, but accumulating into something extraordinary when viewed from a distance. There were hard winters and failed harvests and losses that tested them. There were arguments that shook the lodge walls and silences that lasted days. There were moments of doubt and moments of grace and long stretches of ordinary life that were, Clara came to understand, the most valuable thing of all. Silas never married. He never seemed to need to. His anger softened over the years into something more like intensity, a fierce commitment to the valley and the work in the family that had become the center of his world. He remained Clara's most unexpected ally and her most honest critic, the person who would tell her the truth when everyone else told her what she wanted to hear. And sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the compound was quiet, Clara would find a new carving on her desk. A wildflower, a mountain peak, once a pair of hands clasped together, small and perfect, and carved from a single piece of wood. Jonah married eventually a school teacher from a settlement 2 valleys over, a quiet woman who shared his love of music and his gift for seeing beauty in ordinary things. They built a house near the creek, and their children grew up alongside Clara's, a tangle of cousins who treated the entire valley as their personal kingdom. Gideon grew into the man his mother might have hoped for if she had lived to see it. He became less guarded over the years, less calculating, more willing to lead with trust instead of strategy. Clara watched the change with the particular satisfaction of someone who had helped cause it, not by changing him, but by giving him a reason to change himself. 25 years after a desperate girl walked out of a dying cabin and did not look back, Clara Hawthorne stood on the porch of the lodge her husband had expanded 3 times to accommodate a growing family. She was 48 now, her hair threaded with silver, her face weathered by mountain sun and wind into something that was not young, but was, she thought, more interesting than young had ever been. Her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had worked every day of her life, and she wore them the way Gideon wore his scars as evidence of a life fully lived. Gideon stood beside her, 58, and slower than he used to be, his beard gone gray, his shoulders still broad enough to fill a doorway. His hands, which had built and carried and fought and held, rested on the porch railing beside hers, not touching, but close enough that the warmth between them bridged the gap. Below them, the valley was alive with evening. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, workers finishing their day, children running between buildings. Jonah's oldest playing guitar on the bunkhouse porch, the melody drifting up through the summer air. Across the yard, Silas was mending a fence. 51 years old and still the biggest man in any room, still the first to arrive when something needed doing and the last to leave when it was done. He looked up, found Clara on the porch the way he always found her, as if his eyes were calibrated to her location, and gave a single nod. Brief, almost invisible. Clara nodded back. 55 fence posts now, not 14. 55 surrounding a compound that had grown from a secret to a community to something that looked very much like a legacy. "Do you remember what you said when you first proposed?" Clara asked Gideon. "That I valued honesty over romance. You were right and wrong at the same time. I'm right that honesty matters. Wrong that it rules out love. We built the love on top of the honesty. That is why it held. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him the way she had learned to do over 25 years, not because she needed the support, but because choosing to lean was its own kind of strength. No regrets, he asked. She thought about the cabin, the 14 fence posts, the girl counting them through frosted glass, the letter that changed everything, 3 men at a crossroads, a valley hidden from every map, a fire that almost destroyed them, a choice that saved them. Not one, she said. I would not change anything, not even the hard parts, especially not the hard parts. They taught me who I could become when I stopped accepting other people's definitions of what I was worth. They taught us what we could build together. She looked out over the valley, this place that had been a secret and become a home, that had been a business arrangement and become a love story, that had been a desperate gamble and become the foundation of everything that mattered. We are stronger together than apart, she said. Built this with our own hands, Gideon replied. Below, the evening settled over Shadow Creek Valley. Lights glowed in windows. Guitar music drifted on warm air. Somewhere a child laughed, and somewhere a door opened, and somewhere a fire was built against the coming dark, and the mountains stood around it all like sentinels, patient and eternal, keeping watch over the life that had been carved from their granite heart by four people who started as strangers and became something no one could have predicted. Clara still remembered that morning at the crossroads. The frozen mud, the 3 men, the bag in her hand, and the terror in her chest, and the voice of her dying father telling her to be brave but not reckless. 25 years later, standing on the porch her husband built, watching grandchildren chase each other through wildflowers that grew where the old workshop had burned, she thought that was the day my real life began. She had come to these mountains with nothing but courage and a contract and the stubborn refusal to believe that desperation was the same as defeat. She had found something she never expected. Not just wealth or safety or even love, though she had found all three. She had found herself, the woman she was capable of becoming when someone believed in her enough to give her the chance and she believed in herself enough to take it. The mountains held their ancient silence. The wind moved through the pines. And Clara Hawthorne, who had once been Clara Whitfield, who had once been a girl counting fence posts and wondering if hope was worth the effort, closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the life she had built and knew with absolute certainty that it was.